In psychology, abusers are known to use a technique called DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victimizer, and offender. It's a way of making themselves seem like the victim and making the actual victim in the situation seem like the original offender. But why and how? In this video, I'm going to explain how abusers fundamentally don't understand cause and effect when it comes to human interactions. They don't understand that it's their own abusive behavior that causes certain negative reactions, and then they weaponize those said negative reactions to frame themselves as victims. If this is a topic that hits home for you, I will be putting some extra resources in the description box below. But without further ado, let's get into it. Just as a reminder, now that the new year is coming up, I have a couple of new resources. One of them is Goal Getter, my course on how to embody the mindset and habits of winners. This is a particularly good time of year to get it if you have a New Year's resolution that you're really hoping to achieve this year. And then I also have Living in Alignment with Nature Cycles, my new journaling workbook. January is also the easiest time of year to start this if you want to start living in alignment with the seasons and the cycle of the moon. Check those out in the description box. So let me give you a scenario. You're at the supermarket, you go to grab some cereal, when a person comes up behind you, pushes you out of the way, and takes the cereal box that you were reaching for. Flustered, you say, "Excuse me, I was reaching for that, why did you push me?" Then the other person gives you an ugly look and walks away. As they do, you shout after them, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Now, most people who understand cause and effect in human interactions would see the full picture of what happened, and they would think, yeah, that person yelled and cursed at me, but it's because I pushed them. But abusers fundamentally don't understand this cause and effect because they are unwilling to take responsibility for their own behavior. And instead they would think, I can't believe that that person yelled at me and cursed me out. How unfair. Why would someone do that to me? They have completely blocked out their own participation in the conflict, likely through defense mechanisms like denial, repression, projecting, splitting, and so forth, and we'll get to those in a second. So when their harmful behavior precedes a negative reaction from someone else, all they remember is the negative reaction, independent of its context and causality. Here's a different scenario. After decades of emotional abuse and hurtful words, your parents cross a line. Let's say they tell you that you're going to hell for something that you did, and you've just had enough. You stop all contact with them. And then your parents go around telling people that you've crudely cut them out of your life, that you have no idea what they did wrong, showing people how callously you're responding to their last texts, where they were trying to get you back in their good graces. What happened here? Again, they wiped the slate clean when it came to their own wrongdoing, and then they took the victim's behavior out of context and amplified it to portray themselves as the victims. Here's the third scenario. Your friend is telling you that they feel unsupported by you lately. You reply, "The whole world doesn't revolve around you, you know. I'm going through a lot with this exam that I'm studying for." And your friend says, "I know that the whole world doesn't revolve around me, but it would have meant a lot to me if you had at least told me that you weren't coming to my Thanksgiving dinner. Because like I said, I'm going through a lot." And you respond, "I'm sorry, not everything is about your stupid dinner." By this point, your friend is pretty hurt. And they reply, "Got it. And just so you know, not everything is about your test either." And then you go on and tell all your friends that they were unempathic about your test and how stressed you are, and that they told you not everything is about you. Now, what happened here? You said something very hurtful, and then you used the other person's response, which was merely proportional to what you said, a mere reflection of your own words, as a weapon against them. You'll never admit that what you did was wrong, but when someone takes your very own words and reflects them back at you, then you think that what they said was so hurtful and terrible. Like I said, this inability to understand causality is ultimately the result of abusers' inability to take responsibility for their behavior. Why? Because abuse is basically the inability to take responsibility for one's own behavior. Abusers do what they do because they feel entitled to react however harmfully they'd like to even small perceived transgressions, and they continue to take part in that behavior because they don't take true responsibility for their abuse. They don't actually think it's their fault. They think other people deserve what they are doing to them. So how do they do this? How do abusers clean their own slate through defense mechanisms? One method is through denial. Denial in this context could be trying to justify why you didn't do anything wrong. Like the supermarket example, for instance. Let's say that you go to the store manager and tell them what happened, and the store manager brings the aggressor over, and the aggressor says, "That's not true, I merely bumped into you, it was a light tap." That would be an example of them using denial. Now, repression is when the thing that you did never even makes it into your conscious awareness. You're not consciously pushing it out of your awareness. It's happening on an unconscious level. So, for example, in this context, the aggressor genuinely doesn't remember pushing you. Maybe because they were in such an emotionally heightened state that they blacked out or something. Or because the shame of being called out is so unbearable that their unconscious will not let them see the facts of the situation. Then there's also projection, which is when you accuse other people of doing exactly what you did. For example, "No, you were the one who pushed me." And there's rationalization, where you give logical reasons why your behavior was actually correct. For example, "Well, you were taking 10 minutes with the cereal. It's rude to monopolize an entire aisle for that long. And my son only eats that one type of cereal, so I figured I'd snatch it while I could. I'm not a bad person for that." And then there's also splitting, where you split people into either all good, where they're idealized, or all bad, where they're devalued. For example, "Of course I pushed you aside. What you're wearing is an absolute disgrace and you deserve none of my respect." Now here's where it gets complex. Human interactions are an infinite exchange of cause and effect. So how do we disentangle who is the initial aggressor and who is merely reacting to aggression? It's super, super complicated. One thing to keep in mind is that not all human interactions are a victimizer-abuser dynamic. Abuse is unfortunately far too common, but it's not the standard way that people interact. So if you're going about your relationships trying to fit everything into this dynamic, you're probably going to experience some distortions because you are not the victim in all of your relationships. Let's say that there's a 2-year back and forth degradation of a relationship in which both parties feel hurt by the other person and feel righteous in reacting through greater and greater callousness. So let's say Joanna is upset that Chris didn't come to her birthday party. Chris is upset that Joanna didn't then invite him to her graduation party. Joanna is upset when Chris starts ignoring her texts. Chris feels angry when Joanna starts angrily confronting him over his non-responsiveness. Joanna is then deeply hurt by Chris's cold responses, and in the heat of the moment, she tells him he's acting like a loser. And Chris responds that she's a crazy bitch. Who is the aggressor here? It's not so clear-cut. It's a long back and forth history where both parties hurt each other through cause and effect. So it's really important to not take a he started or she started it approach unless there's a chronic established pattern of abuse where one person has power and control over another and uses it to harm the other person. Also, from an abuser's point of view, the way they see things, the victim is the aggressor. Because these tiny little things set them off. They take these tiny perceived transgressions as an excuse to cause serious hurt to the other person. So again, taking the supermarket example. Let's say that you don't like the way somebody's looking at you. Maybe you misread their expression and you say, "What the fuck are you looking at?" And in response to that, they punch you in the face. Technically, you were the aggressor, but they were the abuser because their reaction was so disproportionate that it violated your rights, your right of not experiencing bodily harm, of not experiencing unwanted touch. But an abuser would unfortunately use the fact that you were the original aggressor to make themselves seem like the victim. So this makes it very, very tricky for even therapists who are treating, let's say, couples to figure out who's the abuser and who's the victim. And that is why I'm very reluctant to give my own evaluative assessments of who's the victim and who's the abuser in situations where I don't even know those people. But there are some questions to kind of help gain clarity on this. One question is, did one person violate the basic human rights of another person? For example, did one person forbid the other person from speaking in therapy about their relationship, thereby violating their right to free speech, their right to emotional processing? Does one person not let the other wear what they want to wear or go where they want to go? Does one person disregard the other person's consent by touching them in an unwanted way, whether that means a creepy hug or a slap to the face? Another question to help disentangle who's the abuser and who's the victim is, does one person weaponize a disproportionate amount of power and control over another person, like a parent who restricts their child to an excessive extent, or a spouse who uses their finances to control their partner? Or does one person react extremely disproportionately? Because like I said, abusers will often take a tiny, tiny trigger, let's say, and use it as a justification to react in really disproportionate ways. But there's a caveat here, because sometimes victims react disproportionately too. And that needs to be considered within the larger context of how many times they've been abused and dysregulated. And another question to consider: is one person unable to take genuine responsibility for their actions? Taking genuine responsibility looks like a verbal apology and acknowledgement of wrongdoing, of hurt caused, a commitment to changing their behavior in the future, then actually following through with action, actually changing their behavior, empathy throughout this process. What it doesn't look like is things like, I'm sorry, but, I'm sorry if, I'm sorry and then it happens again. Excuses, justifications, rationalizations, deflecting, blame shifting, DARVO, like we talked about, or continuing to engage in the harmful behavior, because abusers will often apologize to the victim and say, I'm so sorry, this and that, it'll never happen again, I swear to you, and then it of course happens again and again and again. The proof is in the pudding. So I hope that this video gave you a little bit of clarity on why abusers use DARVO, how they kind of block out their own part in these interactions, why it's super complicated to figure out who is the true victim in these situations, and some questions as a jumping off point to help you gain clarity on that. This is a super complicated topic because in the world of abuse, down is up is down, everything is topsy-turvy, so it requires a lot of carefulness. I tried to be as comprehensive as possible with as many caveats and different considerations as possible, but ultimately it is impossible for me to catch all of them in one short video, so I hope that this was merely just a jumping off point for you to gain some insight. I hope this helped, and I'll see you next week.